was born in a little village, Valtelli, which is just outside of Lucca in Italy, between Lucca and Pisa. His dad was a butcher, as was his grandfather and great-grandfather and great-grandfather. They had the butcher shop there in Valtelli. His dad came over to the United States shortly after 1900 and worked for the railroad up in Maine on the line, laying track and stuff like that. And the story is that his dad had his lunch stolen one day. He didn't speak any English, so he couldn't explain, what had happened. He couldn't do anything about it. And that motivated him to start going to what we would call night school and taking English. And then after he was here a couple of years, he went back to Italy and married my grandmother, and my dad was born there. And then they came over back to the United States and wound up in Michigan. And at that time, Dad was born in 1903, so they get over here about 1905. There was a lot of prejudice regarding Italians. The Italians were going through the same sort of things that the Irish did when they came over after the big potato famine. And they would not permit my grandfather to practice his trade as a butcher. So he was up in Hancock, Michigan, which is really way north of, probably one of the northest locations in the United States, and he wound up in the copper mine. And after he worked there for a while, I guess about 1912, something like that, he came back into Illinois, and they wound up in Christian County, which is just southeast of Springfield. And it's a coal mining town that was completely run and owned by Peabody Coal Company. I mean, they owned the stores, they put up the school, they owned the streets, the lights, the houses that they rented to the workers. And when Dad was in the 7th grade, his father told him that he was going to have to drop out of school and go to work because the family needed the money. Dad was the oldest. He was an oldest, and then next was Otello, and then he had 5 sisters, and then another brother. And so that's what happened. He went out and he was starting delivery for the commissary or the cooperative market that they had there in Kincaid. The following year, the school principal, who had taken a liking to my dad, convinced him that he ought to come back and take the graduation exams, because he thought Dad was smart enough that he would pass it and he could get a diploma that way, although he had never attended 8th grade. Dad did that, and he did pass, and so he did in fact get a diploma. And he just worked in the Peabody Coal Company mine in that area, and married Mom, and then we all started coming around. And by the time that the trouble, as it's referred to, started in 1932, there were 6 of us, 5 sisters and myself. And what had happened is that Dad's version of it is that John L. Lewis, who was the international president of the United Mine Workers in collusion with Peabody, approved the contract that the rank and file never even had a chance to vote on and was not in favor of. It cut their daily wage from something like $5.95 a day down to $4.25 a day. And so my father and a whole group of other miners, activists, got together and formed what is referred to as the Progressive Miners of America, in competition with John L. Lewis outfit. And it is a very violent history in labor, organized labor. Shootings, houses being bombed, railroad property being bombed, railroads being destroyed, just a whole bunch of stuff. There is a book, matter of fact, Michael, what is it? It's not right. Munoz has my copy of it. It's called United Divided Kingdom, written by a professor there in Illinois, but it's basically oral history of people who did in fact participate in that era. And after, you know, five years of attempting to get the contracts with the mines rather than the United Mine Workers of America, Dad had to just say, hey, I can't do it anymore. I've got 6 kids. I'm not getting any. He then got paid for 5 years.
Wow.
There were just instances. I was very young at the time. I was born in 31, so, you know, in 32 when it started, I wasn't very, and when Dad left in 36, obviously I wasn't very old, so I don't have too many memories of Kincaid, Illinois, except I do remember one occasion when Dad came in the middle of the night, so to speak, to visit with my mother, and then came into my crib, leaned over the crib to kiss me, and I saw the gun in his waistband. And years later, when I was old enough to start talking about it, he said, yeah, that was a necessity. There was no place that he could go in those 5 years that he could risk being unarmed, because violence was just everywhere. There were newspaper articles talking about him traveling from one location to another and having the vehicle that he was in just shot to hell by thugs that the Peabody Coal Company had brought in order to control the progressive miners. They brought in what we refer to as scabs from Kentucky and West Virginia to take the place of the miners who were out. Yeah. It was one of those situations where you had, sort of like the Civil War, where you had longtime friends, some that were out on strike, others that went back to work, and so there was that tension and animosity and anger that happens when a community falls apart. It's sort of like your family, when all of a sudden, you know, your brother or your sister does something that just really upsets you, and you're estranged, and yet you're of the same blood, and it's just one of those sad things that you're not able to resolve those differences and come along. Grandpa came out here to visit a brother that was up, had a ranch up in the Delta with one of my dad's sister and with his mother. And when he got back to Illinois, he told Dad about the Italian enclave that he discovered in San Francisco, South San Francisco primarily, and that there were a lot of Italian farmers up in the Delta where his brother was, and that Dad ought to think seriously about coming out here and looking for employment, because it would be safer. And so Dad did. He came out in 1936, and a year later he had put enough money together that we were able to come out, the 6 of us with my mother, and we wound up in Alameda. Dad's first employment out here was with the Simmons Mattress Company over in San Francisco. And then a family connection came out to this area and started a remodeling business, and Dad went to work for him. And that's how he got into the carpenter trade. In the mines, Dad was basically a millwright. He did, in those days, the coal cars were made out of wood, and Dad did a lot of repair to them, of building them and putting them together. He did a lot of explosive setting. I didn't realize that until on one of our hunting trips in Nevada, a rancher was complaining about the fact that people were, this was in the late 40s, early 50s, that hunters were coming in with these surplus jeeps and just tearing up the damn countryside. They were using the roadbed of an old mining railroad system, and just what was happening, they'd run up and down, and they'd gouge out their tracks, would just gouge out the surface, and then when the snows melted, they just started tearing the countryside aside. And Dad says, well, you got any dynamite? I can help you with that. And the guy said, can you? And Dad said, sure. And so Kent Howard had some dynamite, and we watched my dad go off to a bend in around the side of a mountain hill where this track was, and then he came back. We watched him, and then all of a sudden, kaboom, and boy, that slide just came down and covered that railroad track bed just beautifully, and there's no damn way that anybody would get in there. And so I said, you know, where did you learn that? He said, well, that's one of the things I used to do in a coal mine, setting these charges at it. In 1937, 41 progressive miners were indicted, a federal indictment that was based in the fact that they were blowing up railroad bridges and railroad tracks, and that was interference with interstate commerce and a federal offense, and that they had also destroyed Peabody Coal Company property. If Dad had remained in Illinois, he would have been he would have been 42. There's no question about it. The whole situation was just violent. Dad, we lived in Christian County, and adjoining county was Nokomis. In those days, the county sheriff was just overlord. I mean, if he said yes, it happened. He said no, it didn't happen. And fortunately for Dad, the sheriff that ran Nokomis County was sympathetic to them and liked him and his good friend Ray Tambazi, and just, he gave him sanctuary. But Dad had to sneak into Christian County because they were looking for him there. They blew up the house across the street because they thought it was ours. There are newspaper articles and a part of a congressional record that George Miller put in there about the fact that we would sleep in the basement of our house because it was getting riddled with bullets all the time. And, you know, my mother was there, 6 kids. It was one of those situations that you can really be proud about in some respects, because it showed how people really cared about each other and took care of each other. You know, with Dad not having any salary for 5 years, well, how did we eat? You know, how did we have something to wear? Well, that's because everybody shared. Everybody shared. If you had, you shared.
So the neighbors, the cousins,
yeah. You know, it was just like a big family. Everybody taking care of everybody. My maternal grandmother had a farm, so there was some produce, and you know, that we were able to get from that side of the family. But you just think about it, you know, but with the sacrifices my mother made, trying to keep 6 kids together with an unemployed husband and father of 5 years, and someone whose life was on the line, literally, that there was, you know, any time Dad could have been killed.
So what made him such a leader, and B, if you'll pardon the expression, a shit disturber? Why was he, where'd that come from?
Well, I don't think that, well, he just understood fairness. He was, he got involved with what was referred to as the Wobblies, and a socialist group. His dad was an outright socialist. There was no question about it. The next boy, Othello, died from leukemia just after his 12th birthday, and I remember seeing the obituary.
This is your uncle.
He would have been my uncle, right? And before, you know, Othello's death. And man, it was really just a tribute to the socialist movement more than it was personalized as to the fact that he was lost a son. His dad's sense of justice, I wished, just like we were talking about before we meet, you know, that I should have gotten off my butt and interviewed Jim Green like I always intended to. I never really got to sit down with my dad and cross-examine him really about some of these things, but his experiences in the common affairs of life just made him a different kind of a guy. You know, here he is. His formal education was 7 grades. He comes out here, and he gets involved. He worked with Archie Green at the Moore Brothers dry docks, you know, shipyards during the war, and of course he and Archie had a lot of talks. Archie tells me that they used to, Dad was on the launching crew, and they would come up and they would have lunch together. And one day, Archie Green was just expounding on the virtues of John L. Lewis and what he had done for the labor movement. And then all of a sudden my dad pops up and he said, "You don't know what the hell you're talking about." He said, "You know, that man did more to harm the actual working family than you can possibly imagine." "Well, who are you?" "Well, I'll tell you who I am." And so they started talking all the time and became extremely close friends and very respectful of one another. And it was interesting to me because, you know, Archie Green was a UC Berkeley graduate. And he's working in a shipyard because, you know, that he is really in tune to the working family, and so was Dad. The two things my dad really spent his life dedicated to was the Carpenter family, the working family, and making sure that they had what they were entitled to. And education, he was really, really a champion of public education. He did a lot of things in Alameda countywide to foster public education, you know, support of bond issues and innovation as far as some of their programs are concerned. And then as to the Carpenter family, you know, that was it. You just think they needed to have a fair shake, and they were entitled to a portion of a bigger portion of the pie, so to speak. When in the early part of 1950, Dad at that time was the recording secretary of Local 36 of Oakland, but he got appointed to the negotiating committee, which was kind of unusual that an actual working rank and file member would be part of this negotiating committee with the AGC and the home builders of the East Bay. And he showed up, so to speak, you know, he stood out. That's a better term. He stood out in his being able to handle people and negotiate. And so when the contract was ratified, several of the committee came up to him and said, "You know, we very much would like to have you run for Secretary Treasurer of the Bay District Council of Carpenter." That Ryan had at that time. Ryan had started, I think, in 1930. Had that job and had it in 1950 when Dad was on the negotiating committee, and he wasn't really convinced that you ought to challenge an incumbent, but it kept percolating and percolating, and it got to the point, as you guys probably understand better than I do even, that, you know, Ryan got the message. You're in serious trouble if this goes to a contest. So Ryan retired, and Dad was elected to the position.